Swarming has become a buzzword for post-humanists and a snake oil for strategy consultants, a watchword for revolution and a resource for biomimetic innovation, an organizing principle, and those of you based in Providence may have seen this all around the city or versions of it, and a military venture. Swarming's ideological infidelity is perhaps nowhere better demonstrated than in Lady Gaga's 2017 Super Bowl halftime show, in which an American flag comprised of colorfully lit drones swarmed behind Gaga as she segued from "This land is your land" to the Pledge of Allegiance. A number of articles about this homo-nationalist spectacle bespeak the incessant conjuring of swarms in terms of the cutting edge, the future that is queer and now. Even more frightening than the specter of a swarm hug, however, is the temporal tethering of drone swarms to imminent futures that overlooks the ongoing histories of racial violence that make them possible. So while genealogies of swarm robotics and of swarming as an organizational schema never fail to mention ants and bees, they consistently allied segregation, despite the fact that economist Thomas Schelling's 1971 segregation models were absolutely crucial to the development of computational agent-based modeling, the linchpin of artificial swarm intelligence. But rather than chart, or we'll go back and look at this because why not? But rather than chart a technical trajectory from segregation models to drone swarms, I want to suggest that Schelling's work can be made to reveal something like the unconscious of complexity theory, its exclusion of exclusion. In other words, Schelling's understanding of neighborhood segregation as the unforeseeable offshoot of an organic self-organizing system inadvertently divulges the under-theorized dynamics of privation at the heart of historical and contemporary holisms, and I would count complexity among the latter. So for all of its insistence on wholeness, horizontality, creativity, and relationality, holism in its many guises seems to require, as some kind of unspeakable guarantee, exclusion and expulsion. To be sure, ants and bees are not immaterial here. The bee swarm was the principal metaphor of Montpellier vitalism, one of holism's 18th century progenitors. And this is something that Canguilhem refers to repeatedly as Hippocratic vitalism, which actually makes more explicit its affinities with holistic medicine. But in any case, modeling what is unique to the animal economy, a kind of concept of the organism, members of the Montpellier Medical School faculty saw in the bee swarm the crucial features of what we now call a complex system, a whole qualitatively different from the, a whole qualitatively different from the sum of its parts, capital L life emerging from the minute interactions between many component lives, and a nonlinear organization that left room for contingency and recursion. And the reason I bring up the status of the swarm in the history of vitalism, really briefly here, is not only to signal the kinship between complexity and vital materialism, which I'll talk about a bit later, but because I'm trying to work towards something like a vital necropolitics, which is not just a necropolitics that has as its goal the fostering and flourishing of certain populations at the price of the premature death of others, but a necropolitics that relies on explicitly vitalist concepts like swarming. So the first part of this paper will situate Schelling in the context of complexity theory to argue that segregation is the epistemic precondition of self-organization, one of complexity theory's central tenets. And the second part will look at how swarming is conjured in imaginaries of counterinsurgency and the war on terror. So part one, birds of a feather, segregation and self-organization. In his 1971 paper, Dynamic Models of Segregation, written with support from the Rand Corporation, then Harvard economist Thomas Schelling set out to map how macro-level patterns of segregation arise from micro-level interactions between individuals. Not content to completely sweep post-war practices of neighborhood segregation or the incentivized evacuation of whites from city centers to incipient suburbs under the rug, but not willing to actually account for them either, Schelling models a segregation apparently untainted by either economics or, quote, organized discrimination, a system-level segregation unplanned, unpredicted, and potentially unwanted by those individuals that comprise it. So Schelling's first models were one-dimensional rows of pluses and circles rearranged over several iterations according to a set of rules. Delimiting a neighborhood by the 4 pluses or circles to either side of an individual, and assuming that everyone would want at least 4 of those 8 to be like him, those lacking this, quote, bare racial majority moved to the nearest satisfactory position. And here he indicates those unsatisfied agents with the dot above them. After just 2 iterations, Schelling's model produced a, quote, striking result, a stark segregation of pluses and circles. And here you can see a kind of 2-dimensional version of the model, though I don't know what its parameters are. So in other words, the desire for just a little racial majority triggered the asynchronous but collective motion of individuals away from those unlike them. And of course, this striking result, this ostensibly emergent and unenforced segregation, is predicated on Schelling forgetting that white supremacy shapes and structures the individual comforts, preferences, feelings of contentment, and desires to flee that he repeatedly references. Or else segregation becomes an emergent property of a self-organizing system only on the condition that racialization remains unthought. Though Schelling never uses the word homophily, popularized by Columbia sociologists Paul Lazarsfeld and Robert Merton in 1952, his models are frequently taken to demonstrate the principle that birds of a feather flock together. If, as Wendy Chun has argued, homophily not only erases conflict, it also naturalizes discrimination, then it does so precisely as a biological systems metaphor, a figurative invocation of flocking. So while the term swarm intelligence didn't come into use until 1989, its parent concept, self-organization, became commonplace with the 1977 publication of both Ilya Prigogin's Self-Organization and Non-Equilibrium Systems and Herman Hacken's Synergetics, an introduction to non-equilibrium phase transitions and self-organizations in physics, chemistry, and biology. And it's worth noting here that the Austrian neoliberal Friedrich Hayek, to whom Foucault devotes much of The Birth of Biopolitics, was in dialogue with both Prigogine and Hacken at this time and visited both of their working groups at the Free University in Brussels and Stuttgart University, respectively. So as the field-defining book on swarm intelligence puts it, theories of self-organization originally developed in the context of physics and chemistry to describe the emergence of macroscopic patterns out of processes and interactions described at the microscopic level, conveniently alighting Hacken's chapters on ecology, sociology, and economy. So by positioning Schelling as an early theorist of self-organization who cannot be written out of the annals of complexity theory for being a practitioner of the soft sciences, my intention is not, of course, to validate his conclusions that neighborhoods are self-organizing systems, or that segregation is, in the language of the swarm intelligence textbook, an emergent property of the system rather than a property imposed upon the system by an external ordering influence, right? And we can remember here Schelling's insistence on this being a segregation that is not organized, not kind of imposed from without of the system. In other words, self-organization was not applied to social systems after its epistemic establishment in physics and chemistry, but was catalyzed by precisely the social dynamics of US anti-Black racism. In even other words, exclusion begets emergence. So while swarm intelligence is the subtext of Schelling's article, in his 1978 book, Micromotives and Macrobeaviors, it becomes text. In a move much beloved by complexity theorists, and indeed Schelling goes on to teach at the New England Complex Systems Institute, a kind of strange cousin to the more esteemed Santa Fe Institute. He compares the free market to an ant colony. In most countries, and especially the countries with comparatively undirected economic systems, the system works the way an ant colony works, with each ant in its own little world. Whether we like it or not, Schelling writes, whether we like it or not, Schelling writes, we should be wonderstruck by the enormous complexity of the entire collective system, a system that the individuals who comprise the system needn't know anything about or even be aware of. If we see pattern and order and regularity, we should withhold judgment about whether it is the pattern and order of a jungle, a slave system, or a community infested by parasitic diseases, and inquire first of all what it is that the individuals who comprise the system seem to be doing, and how it is that their actions in the large produce the patterns we see. So Schelling's likening here of ecology, the jungle, to necropolitical economy, slavery, as two self-organizing systems is to me far more striking than the emergent segregation he claims his models produced. Even more striking is that a not dissimilar move is made by Diana Kuhl and Samantha Frost in their introduction to the anthology New Materialisms, Ontology, Agency, and Politics. quote, tumbleweeds, animal species, the planetary ecosystem, global weather patterns, but also new social movements, health and crime, and economics are all amenable to the kind of explanation developed by complexity theorists. Such phenomena are now understood as emergent systems that move with a superficially chaotic randomness that is underlain by patterns of complex organization, which in turn function as foci for further organization and development. And then skipping a little bit, their logic of proliferation is again resonant with new materialist senses of contingent imminent self-transformation. And then further down, one can discern in such material productivity a post-humanist sense of material agency and a limitation of humans' agentic efficacy. This last point indeed recalling Schelling's insistence that emergent segregation is out of human hands. So here Kuhl and Frost are alluding to Ilya Prigogine and Isabel Stenger's book, Order Out of Chaos, in which Prigogine reprises his Nobel Prize-winning discovery of dissipative structures, chaotic systems in far from equilibrium conditions that spin off emergent and orderly effects, with a side of what N. Catherine Hales chides as metaphysical speculation. She writes, Ilya Prigogine and Isabel Stenger's Order Out of Chaos should carry a warning label. Caution, use at own risk. So here we arrive at the point. Complex systems are not complex systems, or rather reducing all kinds of disparate organizational phenomena to the same model or kind of explanation elides precisely the fact that Schelling's emergent segregation is entirely expected and therefore not emergent at all. Weather patterns may be the preeminent example of the unpredictability of complex systems, but the total climate of anti-Blackness, to riff on Christina Sharp, renders Schelling's outcomes not only predictable, but indeed unavoidable without human intervention. That neighborhood segregation is crucially different from the kinds of systems described by chemists like Prigogine or ethologists like E.O. Wilson should come as no surprise, and yet accounts abound in which neighborhoods, economies, and other systems whose macro level outcomes are engineered towards very profitable ends for some are likened to ant colonies or tornadoes. And we expect this from the likes of Stuart Kauffman, a kind of stalwart of neoliberal complexity theory. But one would hope that Kuhl and Frost's at least cursory familiarity with those old materialisms would preclude them from buying the argument that economics and meteorology are importantly analogous. Instead, it seems to be the case that variants of process philosophy, affect theory, etc., flatten out the field of difference to such a degree that the specificity of human and social systems are swept under the rug of immanence. Put differently, the new materialisms reproduce complexity's exclusion of exclusion. Enamored of contingency, creativity, and vitality, they neglect the dynamics of domination and death dealing on which so many systems concepts rest. So part 2, from ant colony to empire, drone swarms, and vital necropolitics. In 2002, the aerospace behemoth Boeing began backing In Situ, the manufacturer of a small commercial fishing drone that could track schools of tuna more easily and more economically than a helicopter. Founded by naval architect Alejandro Pita and engineer Tad McGeer, In Situ designed the C-scan for visual reconnaissance aboard tuna seiners. But in the wake of the US invasion of Iraq the next year, the C-scan became the Scan Eagle and was swiftly deployed as a surveillance drone for the 1 Marine Expeditionary Force. Commenting on In Situ's shift in focus, PETA stated, "We had other fish to catch. We went there. We helped the Marines in the siege of Fallujah. We're still there." So in this section, I argue that Schelling's skirting of human specificity in his implicit rendering of segregation, an emergent property of a self-organizing swarm, and his explicit identification of the free market with an ant colony is redoubled in the ecological imaginary of global counterinsurgency, where the survival of the eagle as a metonym for the US nation state requires that insurgents sleep with the fishes. And here we can glean both the denial of the difference that humanness makes, right? A rejection of the radical incommensurability of economies and ant colonies, of geopolitics and ecologies, as well as a naturalization of necropolitics that authorizes killing with impunity. Or else the first denial of human difference, the making of invasion into biological predation, right? We had other fish to catch. And relatedly, the enthusiasm for swarming within the Department of Defense produces a second refusal of human life in the unchecked execution of extremists and the pervasive uncounting of collateral damage, notably a phrase that Schelling coined in 1961. So Schelling's suggestion that we can understand segregation as swarm intelligence without having to account for the social scaffolds the embrace of swarming by the US military, which labors to imagine counterinsurgent intervention as a matter of ecology. In his opening remarks at the 2003 conference, Swarming, Network-Enabled C4ISR, George W. Bush appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Networks and Information Integration and CEO of the consulting firm Global Resilience Strategies, Linton Wells II described the meeting's goal. Quote, armed with the lessons of military history, ideas drawn from nature, and innovative technology, we are here to accelerate the pace of change within the C4ISR enterprise, which stands for Command, Control, Communications, Computer Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance. Summoning sources from Howard Rheingold's Smart Mobs, which I showed the cover of earlier, to the canonical Swarm Intelligence, the textbook I cited above, Wells figures swarming not only as a technical horizon, but as a natural resource overdue for extraction. For the kind of constant coupling of drone swarms to coming days in the RAND publication Swarming and the Future of Conflict and Swarming and the Future of Warfare, these researchers nevertheless belabor that this revolution in military affairs will require a look back, a return to the heretofore overlooked techniques of nature. And there's a lot to say about this conference that I won't get into here, but the most amazing part I think might actually be the cover art, in which war is being waged by animated bees, fish, and ants. Representations of the scan eagle partake of this logic as well. The scan eagle is self-consciously stylized not as a spectacle of technical modernity, but as a subtle testament to the symbiosis of the natural and the artificial, to a future of originary unity in which ecology and empire go hand in wing. Compared with this photograph of the General Atomics Predator flying over Afghanistan, the pastel mutedness of which conjures a sense of computational rendering, the scan eagle appears appreciably more organic. And this is something that I think we have to understand is absolutely intentional. So weighing just 35 pounds and priced in 2004 at $70,000 a unit, the scan eagle is indeed a far cry from the Northrop Grumman Global Hawk or the General Atomics Avenger, both costing in the tens of millions. As John Bonet puts it in his article, A Little Guy Flies with the Big Boys, the scan eagle is smaller, smarter, and cheaper, a claim that echoes Bruce Clough's off-cited definition of swarming in a paper given at the 2002 Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems International Conference. Swarming is getting a bunch of small, cheap things to do the same job as an expensive, smart thing. Clough, chief of the Future Capability Branch at the Air Force Research Laboratory, belabors the point that while a buzzword among defense specialists, swarming is only suitable for very specific undertakings, such as, quote, kill box situations in which we don't care what it attacks, but also search and surveillance missions, and perhaps most importantly, reducing the Air Force budget allocated to software developers. Swarming's circumscribed utility is the consequence of its nonlinearity. Swarms are reactive rather than predictive, their behavior probabilistic rather than planned. Therefore, Clough writes, many tasks that we deliberate humans do are not well suited to emergent behavior. And then further down, remember, we want determinism at the top level, win the war. We don't always need determinism at the lowest level. Notable here is Clough's footnote, or note 6. Such things as riots and barroom brawls are emergent behaviors of humans, as well as the stock market and urban sprawl, so maybe we aren't that deliberate after all. This extraneous aside, not worthy of inclusion in the body of Clough's talk, betrays precisely the exclusion of exclusion subtending swarm intelligence. For Clough, not only the free market, but urban sprawl, the abandonment of city centers that aggravates extant patterns of segregation, exemplifies unplanned and unpredictable emergence, the promise and potentially the peril of swarming's military applications. At the inception of swarm intelligence is the naturalization of neighborhood segregation, and it is no surprise that its technical and theoretical uptake in counterinsurgency will enable the lethal isolation of insurgents and the imperial installation of new urban infrastructure via ideas drawn from nature, or that flocking algorithms and digital pheromones will produce atmospheres inimical to the life of those other fish, the Piscean prey of the avian symbol of American freedom that the scan eagle set out to catch. Drone swarms, with their oft-touted tolerance of attrition, metonymize the creed of neoliberal complexity theory and global counterinsurgency. Certain parts can and must be sacrificed for the sake of the whole, or rather, some lives must be disposed of for the sake of capital L life. In this vital necropolitics, where periodic crisis is the condition of creative emergence, the free market evinces an imminent post-human agency. Environmental justice wreaks havoc on Gaia's resilient self-regulation, and insurgents and counterinsurgents comprise an ecology that makes the US killing of civilians and combatants both evolutionarily ordained and organically executed. So to wrap up, drone swarm research and development signals yet another use of systems thinking in the service of lethal inhumanization. And of course, this vital necropolitics has historical precedents. As Anne Harrington shows in her book Re-Enchanted Science, and as Canguilhem suggests in Knowledge of Life, holism was a rallying cry for the National Socialist Party. So not only were Jews identified with a kind of mechanistic materialism anathema to Aryan wholeness and vitality, but the regime also saw the development of New German therapy, a form of alternative medicine that relied on an herb plantation tended by the prisoners of the Dachau concentration camp. Systems thinking in theory and in practice is indelibly indebted to segregation. Or the whole is unthinkable without wholes, without loci of exclusion and privation, something that the new materialist dalliance with complexity unfortunately forgets. The animalization of terror in the origin story of the scan eagle, exemplar of the small, jum, and sheep, and a boon for drone swarm development, recalls Schelling's identification of the free market with the ant colony. Both use self-organizing systems to naturalize domination. And just as the economy ant colony analogy elides the fact that while not strictly speaking planned, neither is there anything organic about rampant financialization and ever-widening income inequity, the empire ecology analogy labors to forget the lonely hour of the last instance. Clough's determinism at the top level does indeed come. Thank you.